Mr. Lavrov, thank you for doing this. Do you believe the United States and Russia are at war with each other right now?
I wouldn't say so. And in any case, this is not what we want. We would like to have normal relations with...
Friends, I want to share with you the key points from the interview between Sergei Lavrov and Tucker Carlson, which has already made a lot of noise. Carlson, a well-known American journalist, came to Moscow apparently not just out of curiosity. After leaving Fox News, he became an independent journalist seeking to highlight alternative views, and is said to have ended up here in an attempt to bring the Russian point of view to an audience cut off from it by Western media. His visit to Lavrov looks like more than just an interview, it looks like diplomatic intelligence. We will not delay, friends. An interesting issue awaits us ahead. We are starting. Tucker Carlson, who became the voice of conservative America, asked the Russian foreign minister questions that looked more like a strategic probe than a banal exchange of remarks. Many associate this with a political mission. Republicans, including Donald Trump, are seriously concerned about the alliance between Moscow and Beijing. Their main thesis is simple. Biden's actions pushed Russia to work closely with China, and this allegedly became the largest foreign policy failure of the current administration. Perhaps Carlson was trying to find out if there was a chance to return Moscow to the orbit of Western politics. The journalist's questions sounded directly. Is Russia ready to become a partner of the West again? But Lavrov's response was expected to be harsh. We will never return to the situation before 2022. The Russian foreign minister made it clear that trust in the West has been lost forever, and sounded like a person who fully supports the course towards a multipolar world. Lavrov also stressed that Russia's current rapprochement with China is not a temporary measure, but a conscious choice based on common interests. Carlson, by the way, even before the visit, actively criticized Biden's policy, arguing that sanctions against Russia harm the United States and its allies more. He has repeatedly stressed that these measures are destroying global economic ties, and their result is the strengthening of China. This view coincides with Trump's position, which believes that America should focus on deterring Beijing, rather than getting into an expensive conflict with Moscow. Curiously, this analysis is shared by some American experts. For example, former CIA analyst Raymond McGovern noted that attempts to isolate Russia only accelerate its integration into new international alliances. In his opinion, Moscow has long learned to benefit from sanctions, and its cooperation with Beijing has reached record levels, from trade to military coordination. Apparently, Carlson was trying to understand how strong the alliance between Moscow and Beijing is. Perhaps he hoped to hear from Lavrov at least a hint of the possibility of maneuvering towards the West. But he clearly did not receive an answer that would suit Washington. Russia has clearly outlined its position. There is no longer any trust in the West, and now only its own path. However, is it worth taking the current state of Russian-American relations as a final verdict? Politics is the art of the possible, and even the strongest alliances can change under the influence of new factors. Tucker Carlson's visit to Moscow was another move in a complex chess game between Russia, the United States, and China. Apparently, no direct agreements have been reached, but the very fact of the interview speaks volumes. Perhaps Carlson was preparing the ground for a future dialogue, or maybe it was just a loud journalistic move. Time will tell what role this event will play in the big geopolitical game. Now let's turn to the highlights from the interview itself. Tucker Carlson asked Lavrov a question that worries many. Do you believe that the United States and Russia are now in a very serious conflict? Lavrov replied to this, I wouldn't say that. In any case, this is not what we want. Of course, we strive for normal relations with all countries, especially with a country like the United States. The Russian president always emphasizes his respect for the American people and the achievements of the United States. We see no reason why Russia and the United States cannot cooperate for the common good. However, Carlson did not stop and asked a clarifying question. The United States is financing a conflict in which Russia is involved. Now they allow strikes on the territory of Russia. Isn't this a war? Lavrov responded to this diplomatically but harshly. Officially, we are not at war, but what is happening can be called a hybrid conflict. It is obvious that Kiev's actions, including the use of long-range modern weapons, are impossible without the direct participation of American military personnel. It's dangerous. We don't want to aggravate the situation, but we have to send signals. For example, the recent demonstration of the Orshnik system was such a signal. Carlson then asked about the hypersonic systems demonstrated by Russia. Lavrov explained, "The message for the United States and its allies supplying long-range weapons to the Kiev regime is simple. We are ready to use any means to prevent the West from succeeding in inflicting a strategic defeat on us." This response was made against the background of statements by a number of Western politicians, including representatives of the Pentagon, about the possible need for a limited nuclear strike. Lavrov noted that such threats are of serious concern. He stressed that Russia will not allow the West to advance its hegemonic plans, especially if they affect its strategic interests. Interestingly, in his speech, Lavrov recalled the recent visit of U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, who said that Russia's natural resources should be redistributed in favor of the West. Lavrov objected to this. They are fighting for hegemony, for resources, for a regime that is ready to sell everything. We are fighting for the people who live on these lands, for their right to determine their future. The interview turned out to be intense, and although it did not bring direct sensations, it clearly outlined the Russian position. The country is ready to defend its interests and is not going to make concessions to the West on key issues. What was Carlson looking for in the end? The answer to this question may lie not only in words, but also in those unspoken signals that he took with him. And this is just the beginning, friends. Then the brightest part of the release begins. We watch and listen carefully. Lavrov takes the floor again and continues, "We care about people, not about natural resources, which, as you know, someone in the United States would like to take for themselves." This is an important message that Russia has tried to convey through testing its hypersonic system in real conditions. The essence of the message is that Russia is ready to use all necessary means to protect its legitimate interests in order to avoid misunderstandings in international politics. However, according to Lavrov, some personalities in London and Brussels do not seem to correctly assess the situation. Russia is ready to send additional signals if they do not draw the necessary conclusions. These words of Lavrov can be perceived as a direct challenge to Western diplomacy. In fact, he openly questions the high ideals of the West, which have long been talking not about freedoms and rights, but about the struggle for control, power, and resources. When it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, Russia focuses not on the geopolitical game, but on the tragedy of millions of people trapped in a disaster zone. For Moscow, this is not just a territory on the map, but people's lives, their right to safety and dignity. From Lavrov's point of view, the West is not fighting for rights and freedoms, but for resources, for control over strategic territories and influence in different regions. He emphasizes that for the West, people and their destinies are just statistics, and the West sees an opportunity in the conflict to strengthen its economic and political hegemony. On the contrary, Russia is fighting for those people whose ancestors have been developing lands, building cities and factories for centuries. In this struggle, Moscow defends not only its territory, but also the right to exist for those who live on it. These words not only expose, but also give a clear idea of the essence of the double standards of the West. He who claims to teach others about democracy is the first to forget about it when new economic interests such as oil, gas, or strategic transport corridors appear on the horizon. Russia, in turn, argues that it stands on the side of those who fall victim to these wars, and not those who benefit from them. Lavrov's statement sounds like a cry that reverberates far beyond Russia, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These regions remember well how the Western powers came in peace, but left behind only ruin. Let the West accuse Russia of cynicism, but the reality is that today the choice is not only between Russia and the West, but between the struggle for people and the struggle for resources. Lavrov then shared his thoughts on the events in Bucha. He gave exclusive details regarding the breakdown of the talks in Istanbul. Carlson asked why the negotiations broke down. Lavrov replied that, according to the head of the Ukrainian delegation, David Arahemia, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson insisted on continuing the fight, despite the agreements reached. However, Johnson denied this, and Arahemia, being in negotiations, claimed the opposite. Lavrov recalled that these facts are not mentioned in the Western media, despite the huge resonance that this case caused. Lavrov noted that he himself had repeatedly raised this issue in the UN Security Council. During one of the meetings with the UN Secretary-General, he directly asked to explain why this story was not discussed. Despite the media outcry, Western officials remained silent. Lavrov stressed that it is not journalists, but politicians and officials who should answer these questions, because they are responsible for spreading information and making decisions. How quickly the agenda in the mainstream media is changing. It seemed like only yesterday the whole world was talking about a story that made the headlines of leading publications. Every news feed crackled with indignation. Politicians demanded immediate conclusions, and analysts wondered how this would change the world order. But, as Sergei Lavrov rightly noted, this high-profile episode unexpectedly and somehow very quietly dropped off the agenda. What happened? Has the truth, which was so fiercely demanded to be found, really been found? Or maybe it turned out that the whole plot was not so convenient for further use. It seems that no one is going to give answers to these questions anymore. The most amazing thing is how easily and quickly known countries can switch the attention of society. The plot turns into the main symbol of suffering, from which one cannot look away, but after a while the stage of oblivion begins. History seems to be erased from the collective memory, and no one voices the reasons for this. It's just that everyone is moving on to a new symbol, a new drama, or another historical injustice. This is a classic. Such stories are a tool that is needed as long as they bring political or media dividends. As soon as it ceases to be useful, it is carefully put aside. No one apologizes for mistakes. No one reviews positions. A new main character is simply announced, and the play continues. So if you're wondering why this plot disappeared so suddenly, don't. Something more suitable has taken its place, and questions about what actually happened will probably remain unanswered. Now, turning to the topic of negotiations, Lavrov mentioned the words of President Putin, who on June 14th at the Russian Foreign Ministry confirmed his readiness to negotiate on the basis of the principles agreed in Istanbul. These principles were rejected by former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The key principle of these negotiations was Ukraine's rejection of NATO. Russia was ready to join the group of countries that could provide guarantees of collective security, excluding any NATO participation, military bases, or military exercises on the territory of Ukraine with the participation of foreign troops. These were the conditions that Putin announced in April 2022. However, time has passed since then, and now it is necessary to take into account the changing realities on Earth. Lavrov mentioned that at the moment not only the line of contact between the parties to the conflict has changed, but there have also been changes in the constitution of the Russian Federation, which should also be taken into account. These changes have already led to the fact that certain territories have become part of Russia, and the situation on the battlefield, as well as political conditions, require new approaches. In his interview, Sergei Lavrov discussed in detail the current situation and Russia's position on the international conflict and its relations with the West. Russian president stressed that Russia cannot put up with a situation where legislative acts directed against the Russian language, Russian culture, and the Orthodox Church remain in countries that Russia considers its neighbors. Lavrov noted that the West has been silent since 2017, when this legislative offensive against Russian-speaking communities began, and Russia had to draw attention to this issue in a special way. When it comes to foreign policy, Lavrov touched on Russia's important turn to the East, which, in his opinion, became apparent after Western policy failed. He recalled that for 20 years Washington had ideas to bring Russia into the Western Bloc to balance against the rising East, but this did not materialize. Today, Russia and China are forming an alliance, which, according to Lavrov, is inevitable, given the geography and proximity of the countries. At the same time, Lavrov spoke about how Russia's relations with neighboring countries, such as Finland, have changed. He expressed dissatisfaction with how suddenly, against the background of cooperation with Finland, they returned to military neutrality and resumed their hatred, which causes alarm in Russia. Lavrov also indicated that Russia will not negotiate with the West if they do not take into account its interests. He confirmed that Russia is ready for dialogue, but only if its interests are respected, which includes recognition of new territorial realities, Ukraine's absence from NATO, and changes in legislation to eliminate threats to Russia and its population. The West, in turn, continues to argue that the situation should be resolved taking into account the interests of Ukraine. The leaders of countries such as France and Germany continue to insist on the need to defeat Russia. However, despite the public rhetoric, no real steps are being taken to resolve the conflict, which causes concern in both Europe and the United States. Internal disagreements in the West, the economic consequences of the protracted conflict for European countries, as well as the lack of willingness of political elites to admit mistakes, all this aggravates the situation. Lavrov also noted that Russia is not going to make concessions that endanger its security and is ready to negotiate, but only on equal terms. Despite Russia's efforts to convey its position, trust between the two countries remains at a low level. The problem is not only in the difference of positions, but also in the general distrust that has become the basis of international relations. I would like to express my thoughts, friends. The interview between Sergei Lavrov and Tucker Carlson left me with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I admire Lavrov's professionalism, who skillfully builds arguments and consistently defends the interests of his country. On the other hand, it was obvious that a huge gap of distrust remained between the parties, which hindered constructive dialogue. Lavrov convincingly emphasizes Russia's position, but it seems that his words often go unanswered in the West, which is regrettable. In this interview, Tucker Carlson proved himself to be a journalist who strives to ask sharp questions and raise difficult topics. His interest in Russia's point of view and willingness to give Lavrov the opportunity to speak out is a step that has long been missing in the Western media. This is a rare case when a conversation, even if difficult, was conducted in a spirit of respect and professionalism. I appreciate his efforts in trying to reveal the opposite point of view to a wide audience. I am grateful to both participants for this interview. It provided an opportunity to better understand the positions and approaches to international politics on both sides. Such dialogues, even if they do not lead to immediate results, are important for building bridges in a deep global crisis. Thank you for your attention, friends. Do not forget to write your opinion about the interview. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel. There is a lot of interesting things ahead. See you.